Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. Today, our topic is this: Gamal Abdel Nasser, President of Egypt between 1954 to 1970. Nasser perhaps exemplifies the first generation of Arab leaders during the European decolonization period. Magnetic in character, bold in ambition, and tyrannical in approach. Within Egypt, Nasser and his legacy divides opinion. Did he save Egypt or betray it? Did he do what was necessary, or did he do what was necessary for him? Nasser's influence went well beyond Egypt, and a new book, We Are Your Soldiers, How Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser Remade the Arab World, deep dives into Nasser without borders. Joining us today is the book author Alex Rowell. Alex Rowell is an editor at New Lines magazine and the author of We Are Your Soldiers, How Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser Remade the Arab World, and Vintage Humor, the Islamic wine poetry of Abu Nawaz. His journalism has been published by the BBC, The Economist, and The Washington Post, among others. Alex, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
And it is our pleasure to have you. And this has been, I reread your book. I reviewed it for Middle East Monitor, which our audience can read online, as well as obviously buying your book so they can learn about the topic. It's a really well-written book, very readable. And you seem to have done a very good job at capturing a very complicated topic, which, Nasser is, when we talk about Nasser, as you point out in the book, we're not just talking about, the man, we're not just talking about Egypt, we're talking about well beyond, Egypt itself. We're talking about other Arab countries, and you also know other countries in Africa as well and across Asia. It's a really, big topic to take on. So, but before we sort of get onto the book itself, talk a little bit about you. Could you perhaps tell us what attracted you to reporting on the Arab world, and how did you start?
Yes, so I've actually always had a sort of lifelong tie and connection with the Arab world. I was born in Saudi Arabia, raised in the United Arab Emirates, and lived since 2012 in Lebanon. So I've always had a very profound connection with the region, frankly, more so than with my native Britain, or ostensibly native Britain. So for me, that it was just the natural. It's always been the focus of my writing and my kind of intellectual attention, if I can put it that way.
Yes, it's interesting because a lot of the work you've done, obviously, you've worked for different media outlets and you've done, reporting and stuff from the Arab world itself, but you've also done deep dives in, written books about history, not just Nasser, but also about Islamic attitudes to wine and humor and stuff. So what attracts you to doing this sort of stuff?
Well, the wine book in particular was although I had grown up in the region, mostly in the UAE in terms of my childhood, I hadn't really mastered Arabic because, as you may know, or many listeners or viewers who have been to the Dubai or the UAE or the Gulf in general know, you can sort of get by with English alone. It's unfortunate in many ways, but the local population in the Emirates, for example, is only about 10% of the total residents. So, and English is probably the lingua franca of everyday life. Lebanon was not quite the same. So when I moved to Lebanon in 2012, it became apparent to me that I would have to. I mean, I had been taught Arabic in school, I should say, from the age of 6. So I always knew how to read and write. But it was a bit like how I learned French at school, but I wouldn't be fluent if you threw me into southern France. Lebanon is not quite the same. You do need it in your day-to-day life, and not only a question of needing it. By that stage, I really wanted to master Arabic because I was a journalist by that point, and for professional reasons and for other reasons, it just felt like I wouldn't be doing my job very well if I couldn't converse with an average person in the street in Arabic. So I was learning Arabic, taking classes and so on, and also just from everyday people in conversations. And it was at some point a friend said to me, "Well, if you really want to learn Arabic in a fun way, you need to check out this guy Abu Nuwas, who is this wine poet from the 9th century Iraq." And he quoted a line to me, and of course I didn't understand it, but then he explained it to me. I thought, well, that actually is really, really funny and really clever. And so I went out and bought a book of Abu Nuwas's poems and started just translating them privately from just as a kind of exercise in improving my Arabic vocabulary. Totally useless in everyday life, of course, because you try ordering a drink using some word for wine from 1,000 years ago, and the barman doesn't know what you're talking about. But anyway, it sort of snowballed, and eventually I realized I have over 100 of these translations of old poems, and I started to make them rhyme and everything in English. And in the end, I was in conversation with a publisher at Hearst, Michael Dwyer, and I sort of half jokingly said, what about if we publish these as a book? And he liked the idea. So that's how that book came about.
So, but I mean, I'm sort of also wondering, I mean, because of course, I mean, that's a very unique topic and it's a very interesting story you just told. But I also do wonder about, people who come to the region, the Middle East, to report. Obviously, you're mostly dealing with current affairs, but there is something about people who sort of dedicate themselves, who are Westerners, to reporting from the region, which I think draws them to learning more about history itself. What do you think it is about going to the Middle East that draws so many to history, especially those who are sort of long-term, sort of doing reporting, not just like foreign correspondents who are being sort of parachuted in?
I suppose it is a very deeply historic region. I mean, take a place like Lebanon, you're surrounded by ruins like Byblos or Baalbek, which are many thousands of years old. You can't escape them. So naturally, you are sort of put face to face with a history that is in many cases deeper than what you might be used to wherever you happen to come from. In Britain, we consider a building old if it's 200, 500 years old. In Lebanon, as I say, you might find that part of that wall in that port is 8,000 years old or something. So it's you are forced to reassess your whole perception of history. And I suppose if you're someone who's anyway naturally inclined to wanting to understand more about the past and how the past informs the present, then you are going to end up going down those rabbit holes.
And how do you feel this has enriched your understanding by doing things like this?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's for me to say that it's enriched my understanding, but certainly learning Arabic really opens an entire new universe for you, particularly if you're reporting on the region, obviously. And the Arabic language itself, of course, is very old. I mean, again, if when you're reading the Quran, for example, take the most obvious example, we're talking about 13 or 1400-year-old text that if you learn Arabic, you can actually understand with, of course, some difficulty and some words, but compare that to English, where I think the average native speaker would struggle even to get through Shakespeare. And that's only 400 or something years old by comparison. If you were to read something written 1,000 years ago in Britain, it would be entirely incomprehensible. So the Arabic language itself is a very old and historic one. So again, it kind of gels with what I was saying before, that you are confronted with a civilization really that is extremely old and extremely rich. And you can't help but be impressed by that if you spend any kind of length of time there.
Yeah, I do sort of wonder. I mean, I struggle to read English text from 200 years ago because the
Exactly.
language, Victorian English, is very it's very you feel like you're reading a lot of words. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dickens people would struggle with, myself included. Yeah.
Yeah. But this sort of also leads to us to, today's main topic, which is, of course, the book you've written about Gamal Abdel Nasser. So I sort of want to start here by talking about who is Nasser. Just give us a rundown. Who is Gamal Abdel Nasser? Who is he? Why does he matter?
Yeah, well, Gamal Abdel Nasser was a young junior Egyptian army officer who, in 1952, at the age of 34, led a military coup in Cairo, which overthrew the British-backed monarchy and installed in its place an authoritarian military regime, which he then ruled for the next 18 years of his life until his death in 1970. And which, I mean, mutatis mutandis, I would argue, is still in place today in Egypt. I mean, Egypt is still a country ruled by a former army general, the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces, a man who still makes a point of giving a speech, for example, on July 23rd, which is the anniversary of the 1952 coup, and who has always been happy to draw comparisons or to see the comparison being drawn between himself and Abdel Nasser. So But of course, the story goes well beyond Egypt's borders. Nasser himself, president of Egypt, but also the most popular and powerful leader in the Arab world as a whole during the roughly 2 decades that he was in power, and was an incredibly consequential figure for modern Arab history. I think precisely because he was the first of the post-colonial great regional leaders, if you like. Before Nasser, it was centuries of European colonialism. Before that, the Ottoman Empire, and suddenly you're back into medieval and ultimately ancient history. If you're talking about modern Arab history, it really sort of begins with Abdel Nasser, I feel. And by virtue of being the first regional post-colonial hero leader, he set the tone for the rest of the region. He established the paradigm and the model that other Arab leaders then sought to emulate, often with his encouragement, sometimes with his direct assistance, moral and material. So, to me, a great deal of what the region became and what it still is today can be traced back to the career of Abdel Nasser. And that is really the core argument of my book.
Yes, it's a very interesting character to look at, because I think of all of the authoritarian leaders that came in the Arab world, there is something, obviously Gamal Abdel Nasser, as you're arguing in the book, sets the mold for the future dictators that we see elsewhere and dictators that came around his time and some after. But there is also something distinct about Gamal Abdel Nasser. Yes, he's the first post-colonial leader, but there's also some kind of, charisma to him that people actually buy into, which I feel doesn't really happen with the other dictators. I mean, it's not because the other dictators haven't tried to build those cults of personality, but there is something that feels more genuine when it comes to Nasser. What is it about him that sort of does that?
Undoubtedly, yeah. I mean, the man was a spellbinding orator. Even his critics would have to concede that. Part of it is, I mean, you can get into Arabic language, into the weeds of language, and how he sort of shifted into the dialect, Egyptian dialect, rather than speaking in formal Arabic. And perhaps this makes little sense to someone who isn't familiar with how Arabic works, but it's almost as though you imagine everyone being forced to speak in sort of BBC English, and then you get someone who comes along, and it's almost like Donald Trump in a way. He speaks the language of the man in the street. And Abdel Nasser had an incredible sense of comic timing. I mean, there's all these clips on YouTube that people still share every day of him sort of making fun of this and that leader, whether it's King Hussein or the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And he just, putting aside the content, but just his sense of timing, his ability to get a laugh, he was undoubtedly a very, very skilled speaker. And yeah, all of his imitators, almost to a man who came after him, were very poor imitations of that. I mean, I don't think anybody has any memorable Hafez al-Assad speeches, for example. I think if anyone comes remotely close today, it's probably, pains me to say it, but Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, also has that same facility with language, that ability to connect with the audience on a very intimate level. And by using exactly the same tricks, he switches into Lebanese dialect, he smiles, he tells jokes. Okay, you can call them jokes. His fans certainly lap it up. He is probably, I mean, there are a lot of parallels between Nasser. This is perhaps going down a rabbit hole that's tangential to what we're talking about, but it is an interesting thing that occurred to me many times. Just reading Nasser's speeches as part of my research, I thought, I'm sure I've heard these lines recycled many decades later by Hezbollah's leader, Nasrallah.
Is that what drew you to wanting to spend time actually studying Nasser and producing this book? I mean, obviously you're interested in tracing it going through the Arab world, but there's also something about Nasser that draws people in. And what drew you to want to spend time actually doing this?
Yeah, I think for me it was when I first began to seriously read, real books about Arab history and politics. So about 15 years ago, as a young adult, as I was just getting into journalism and sort of, I suppose, my intellectual and political consciousness was awakening in general, it seemed to me immediately obvious that even upon a cursory glance, that so much of just how foundational the Nasser period was for everything that came after it, and how, as I was saying, all of these regimes that then sprung up, you could just trace the line back to Abdel Nasser. And yet, one searched in vain for a book that kind of made that explicit. It's as though the dots were all there, but no one had quite joined them together. So probably that realization or that thought was the earliest seed for this book. And I remember discussing this with friends at the time, and they all sort of agreed. Another moment came a few years after that, once I moved to Lebanon. And I was at the house of a man named Alex Rowell, who I actually interviewed in the book, and his late father, Gamal Rowell, who was a very important Lebanese journalist, the founder of Al Hayat newspaper, as well as the Daily Star, and really in his day, arguably the most important figure in Arab media as a whole. Assassinated, the evidence suggests, on the orders of the Egyptian regime by Nasser, essentially, or by his intelligence people and his hirelings in Beirut. And I was at Malik, his son. I mean, his son is in his 60s now. I was at his home in Lebanon, and we were talking this same subject. Obviously, I was asking about his father, as one might do in the situation. And he sort of made this side comment that, yeah, of course, all this gesture towards around him, all of this sort of begins with Abdel Nasser, meaning all of the trouble faced by the region today. And that again was a kind of a light bulb moment. Oh, okay, because I've thought that too, and other people have said that too. But again, no one has quite fleshed out the argument certainly at book length in the way that I felt should be done, particularly after the Arab Spring. I mean, there are plenty of good books written on Abdel Nasser, but many of them were written in the 20th century and are now decades out of date. And I think if ever there were a time for a fresh look, it's surely in the wake of the Arab Spring, precisely because it was the very regimes and structures that came out of Nasserism, people like Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak in Egypt, Assad in Syria. These were the very regimes that millions of Arabs had risen up against and sought to overthrow. So it felt to me particularly important that the backstory be understood if we're to have any hope of understanding where those protests originated.
Yes, and it's kind of interesting when we talk about, because you just said the word Nasserism, which is what I want to ask you about now, because Nasser's ideology from the book, you can see this, it sort of forms gradually, as you would expect, actually, based on different experiences. So on the one hand, his biography, when it comes to dealing with, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, is quite interesting because obviously he was never a member of the Brotherhood. But there was a time where he actually worked alongside them, particularly in the late 1940s. And he then obviously shifted against them later on. And I think this is as his ideology of Nasserism is crystallizing. But another important thing that you did highlight in the book as well is he never saw, he was a military officer, as we said, but he never saw military action in the Second World War. But he did see it in 1948 in Palestine, as the Nakba was happening and as Israel was being established. And obviously this plays an important role in forming his ideology. But I think what's interesting from reading that is the accounts of, he was sitting in, Palestine. He was just north of Gaza, I believe. But all the time he's thinking about Egypt. He doesn't seem to care much about, as far as we can tell, Palestine itself at this point. And then there's that famous thing where he has a dinner with a number of Israeli officers, including, I think, 4 future prime ministers of Israel, where they have a truce or an armistice dinner and they're laughing along and they're saying things like, Nasser apparently said, according to one of them, this is the wrong enemy, the wrong time. What was it? Wrong enemy, wrong time, wrong country, or whatever it was.
Fighting the wrong enemy at the wrong time. Yeah, that was according to Yitzhak Rabin, the late Israeli prime minister.
Yes, Yitzhak Rabin was there at that meeting as well. So I sort of wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that, and then how do we end up with Nasserism as it is?
It's very interesting. Yeah, and that was one thing that I really had no idea about before researching the book. And I discovered it in what might seem like the unlikeliest of places, which was Nasser's own book, Falsafat al-Thawra, The Philosophy of the Revolution, published in his own name in 1954, possibly actually ghostwritten by a man named Muhammad Hassanain Haykal, who was kind of his mouthpiece in the media. But in any case, certainly approved. It was the official book by Nasser, where he freely discusses this episode. Yeah, he had been under siege in a place called Fallujah, just outside Gaza, not to be confused, of course, with Fallujah in Iraq, and besieged for many months. And then an Israeli, just a jeep or something, showed up and said, we would like to discuss truce terms, and why don't you guys surrender, and we'll, just do X, Y, Z. And Nasser was one of the two men, I believe, deputized to go and actually speak with these people. And yeah, his account of it is very interesting because you don't get an impression of much hostility to the Israeli soldier himself. On the contrary, he is very interested to learn from the Israeli about the Zionist struggle against Britain. Of course, so as though Egypt and Israel had a shared enemy at the time, which they did in many ways, in the British Empire. And he's asking him, well, how did you organize your resistance movements and how did you gain international sympathy? It's very much like there's a sort of undertone of admiration and let's learn from each other kind of thing. No evidence of much enmity there. And in fact, Nasser's wife's memoir, Tahiyya Abdel Nasser, she wrote a memoir after he died, and she goes even further into this and says that many months after the war ended in 1949, Nasser was then called on again to go and show the Israelis where the remains of some of their dead had been buried in that area. And again, he met the same man. I think his name is Yeruham Cohen, something like that. And the man asked about Nasser's family and congratulated him on the birth of his son Khalid. So again, a kind of weird, almost camaraderie. And that's not to suggest that Nasser was pro-Israel or anything silly like that, but certainly not the blood-curdling kind of militant anti-Israel figure that he later became or later posed as. So I think, and I really do think, much later in life, after 1967, when Israel defeated, in June war of that year, defeated Egypt along with Syria and Jordan in 6 days, and this was obviously a monumental event for Arab politics and history. After that, Nasser almost reverted to what I see as his earlier position and possibly his deep-seated conviction when it came to Israel-Palestine, which was that this is ultimately not an Egyptian national priority of the first order. He began his career as a kind of Egypt firster in that sense, if we can say that, rather than an Arab nationalist. And then he went through this Arab nationalist phase, which ended in tears for all concerned. And he almost reverted because, of course, after 1967, he accepted the famous UN Resolution 242, which was essentially the basis of a two-state solution. It recognizes Israel's right to exist in peace with its neighbors, provided that a just solution be found for the Palestinian refugees and that Israel give up all the land that it occupied post-1967. But that was very controversial at the time, still is controversial. I mean, he fell out quite badly with the PLO and with Palestinians and with other kind of radical regimes of the day like Algeria and Iraq for taking that position. I mean, Syria as well refused Resolution 242. The PLO rejected it out of hand. So he ended as a kind of, what kids today might call a centrist dad type figure, a two-state solution. He patched up with King Hussein of Jordan, and a very different figure to what he had been on the eve of that war, when he had said in speeches, our aim will be to destroy Israel, and that kind of rhetoric.
This is a side question before I go back into what Nasserism is, because there's always this feeling, when Anwar Sadat officially established relations with Israel, normalizing and recognizing them, that this was a massive betrayal of not just the Arab cause, but the betrayal of the cause that people identify with Nasser. But it feels as if we take what you're saying here, the latter years of Nasserism towards the end of his life, it feels maybe like this was the logical conclusion of all of that, that maybe if Nasser had lived another 10, 20 years, he may have done something very similar. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to speculate on where Nasser would have taken all that, because again, he died very shortly after taking that position that I was just saying. But yeah, I have often had the same thought that, I mean, he and Anwar Sadat had been friends since the 1930s. Sadat was the man who Nasser nominated as his vice president. Sadat was part of the official Free Officers Corps that undertook the coup in 52 and very much a pillar of the regime throughout the Nasser period. So these were men who ultimately, I think, thought in similar ways. And as you say, everyone accuses Sadat of having this huge break with Nasserism, but really, I don't think Nasser and Sadat were ultimately so different in their core convictions. Certainly, towards the end of the Nasser years, and it is fascinating to speculate. What if he had lived? What if the negotiations over a two-state solution had gained steam in the 1970s? We can only speculate, but it is interesting to wonder.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, but also Anwar Sadat's an interesting topic in his own right. I mean, didn't he like spy for multiple people in the 1940s? And he's always had that kind of era about him, that he's this deeply Machiavellian character who plays different sides.
Yeah, absolutely, and was more involved in, we're going off topic now, but during World War II, when the Axis looked like it was sort of steaming across Libya, looked like it could take Egypt itself, Sadat had been involved in some way in assisting them with that, which Abdel Nasser had not been, at least not to that extent. But I can't profess to be an expert on Sadat. That's a whole different different era.
Yeah, my feeling is that we'd be here forever talking about Sadat because he was running gun with so many different people. You'd need some sort of physicist with a computer and a database to take us through it all or something. But back to sort of Nasserism, could you actually just tell us, what is Nasserism and how does it differ from other kinds of ideologies that were prevalent at the time? I mean, Nasserism seems to be a kind of pan-Arabism, as I can see it, that centers Nasser as the head of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a deceptively simple question because it's actually not a simple question at all. And I'm not sure that Abdel Nasser himself ever really knew what he stood for. I mean, when you look at his career, there's a constant improvisation going on and a constant search really for what do I and my so-called revolution ultimately stand for? And the answer was different depending on what period of time. So it begins as, again, I say, a kind of Egypt firster mentality. The officers who took over the coup were very much Egyptian nationalists rather than Arab nationalists. If that distinction makes sense. If you look at for a start, there never was a very well-developed political program in place. It's not like they took power and they said, we've got this constitution or something ready to implement. It was very vague. These were young men at the end of the day. Nasser was 34. Many of them were even younger. And they hadn't had the time to develop this kind of thing, even if they had been capable of it. They had to sort of rush their coup, and this is, details that interested people can consult the book. But as the most that they had in terms of a program when they seized power was something called the 6 points or the 6 principles, which were very vague slogans, things like end feudalism, end colonialism, establish social justice, and probably the most amusing one, establish a sound democratic life. Subsequent events attest to how much of that program was implemented. But you notice that it's wholly domestic in scope. It's purely Egyptian. It's purely addressed to the Nile Valley, essentially. Arab nationalism, the Arab nationalist phase of his ideology, came only starting around 1955, mid-1950s, extending into the early to mid-1960s. And when one thinks of highlights like the obvious one, the union with Syria, when Egypt actually merged with Syria into a single state called the United Arab Republic, that was from 1958 to 1961. That's really the heyday of Arab nationalism. When that then imploded in 1961 with a Syrian coup that then brought about Syria's secession, to use the Nasserist term, or independence, to use a more positive term, then the focus became much less about Arab nationalism per se, and this term suddenly appeared, Arab socialism. That became the new sort of state doctrine. And in 1962, they published this document called the Charter, which was a huge exposition of what Arab socialism really meant. I still don't fully understand. I don't think anyone fully understands what Arab socialism means. But anyway, that became the new dogma. Until again, after 1967, with the humiliating defeat, Arab socialism sort of fizzled out, and we were left with, again, sort of, well, where is this all going? What is the direction that the regime is taking? There was never a very clear answer.
Mm. So so in a way, it's whatever Nasser says it is.
on any given day. Yeah, you could say.
Well, that's an interesting thing. But what do you think is driving his behavior? Why does Nasser not? Because it's clear from the book that Nasser doesn't just want to be the leader of Egypt; he wants to be leader of the Arab world as well. What drives him to want to expand this way? Why does he want to do this?
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of related to the previous point as well, because there is no clear reason why he should want to do that. If you know, by about late 1954, he had already got Egypt in his hands. He had established a very firm grip on power there, crushed his opponents, gutted the judiciary, muzzled the press. It was over. This country was locked up, sewn up. He could have just, said, "That's enough for me, and I'll just continue to rule Egypt and let other countries manage their affairs as they please." But he doesn't do that. He takes this leap into the Arab nationalism, which had not been a popular or widespread phenomenon in Egypt, certainly not in the first half of the 20th century, in the way that it had been in other countries like Syria, for example, home of the Ba'ath Party, often referred to as the beating heart of Arabism. The Egyptian intelligentsia were not the same. They had always had a much more Egyptian domestic sort of focus, being mindful of what distinguished Egypt from the rest of the region. Things like the pharaonic heritage on the one hand, or the sizable Coptic Christian population on the other, with their whole separate language and whatnot. Famously, Taha Hussein, who was one of the most prominent Egyptian intellectuals of the 20th century, declared that Egypt was actually part of Europe and that Egyptians were Europeans. And this was, I mean, it sounds almost amusing now, but this was an idea that had some support among Egyptians. So the idea of Egypt as just one part of a single Arab superstate extending from the Atlantic to the Arabian Gulf, that was not a widely held view in Egypt before Abdel Nasser. And as I've already said, I don't believe Abdel Nasser himself ever held that very deeply in his core convictions. He was not someone who had grown up reading the likes of Michel Aflaq, the founding ideologue of the Ba'ath Party, or Sati al-Husari, or any of these other kind of really zealous militant Arab nationalists. Nor was he a Marxist or a Leninist or anyone. He wasn't a very ideological person, full stop, I think. I mean, aside from his core convictions, to the extent that he had any, were wanting to get rid of the British in from Egypt, end colonialism, and vaguely restore a sort of sense of Egyptian national pride. I think if you really want to summarize Nasser's personal core convictions, I don't know that it goes much further than that. So why did he then dive into Arab nationalism and and get into this sort of epic quest for leadership of the Arab world starting around 1955? Well, it goes back to my point of improvisation. I think he was fumbling around for ideas, something that would work, and it happened that this did succeed. There was this controversy in 1955 over the so-called Baghdad Pact, when a number of countries, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, and Britain, all signed a sort of collective mutual defense pact, which on paper looked very impressive. You suddenly had an unbroken chain extending from Europe via Turkey and NATO, through Iraq and Iran and Pakistan, all the way to the borders of China, a sort of solid wall of British allies that might have looked very threatening to the Soviet Union or any other British foe. In practice, of course, it was a very weak alliance, which crumbled very shortly afterwards. Certainly didn't prevent the disintegration of the British Empire. But so Nasser made rather a kerfuffle about this, and he attacked the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri Said, who was kind of really a key driving figure of that Baghdad Pact. This is in 1955. And so the key regional rivalry at the time became between Nasser and Said. And then every sort of state lined up, one behind, either behind the revolutionary camp, as it were, behind Nasser, or as Nasser would have said, the sort of imperialist, colonialist, lackey camp of Iraq. And a key battleground at this time was Syria. It was felt that whoever wins Syria will tip the scales in his favor and establish himself as the truly triumphant leader of the region. And Syria at the time, as I've said, very Arab nationalist. You had the Ba'ath Party on the ascendant. They had done very well in parliamentary elections in 1954. And they were very impressed with Nasser's stance on the Baghdad Pact. And the feeling was kind of mutual. They started to develop a very close relationship in Damascus between the Egyptian embassy and Egypt's sort of clients in general and the Ba'ath Party, really a kind of a special relationship, it has been called, between Nasser and the Syrian Ba'ath. So, the Ba'ath to this day like to say that we taught the Egyptians Arab nationalism, which is obviously, there's a sort of chauvinism to that. But in a way, it's sort of, what they mean is that Abdel Nasser had not been an Arab nationalist until he met us and until we taught him the ways. And that, of course, led ultimately to the Union in 1958. That was how the Union got momentum, and how the Ba'ath eventually persuaded the Syrian army, because ultimately the army were always the power brokers in all of these countries at the time, persuaded a group of Syrian officers to fly to Cairo in early 1958 and literally say to Nasser, we want to unite, we want you to have us, will you do it? And he said, well, these are my terms. The key term was that Syrian political parties had to all be banned, so that Syria's political system would then match that was already prevailing in Egypt. And essentially, the Syrian parliament, Syrian democracy, as Syrians knew it, had to just be scrapped, and Syria had to adopt Egypt's authoritarian system under Nasser's presidency. And the officers were only too happy to agree. I mean, no Democrats themselves. And that was how a totally unelected and unaccountable cabal of Syrian officers dealt a death blow to Syrian democracy. And the rest, as one might say, is history.
So this is an interesting point, because one of the big questions that does come up is, why is the Arab region so authoritarian? There's a tendency to sort of say, well, this is the natural outgrowth of all of the history it's had, or the institutions. But my impression is that as we get to the 1950s, institutions that were developing were quite weak, because a few generations earlier, you had the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which was already weak by that point. The institutions that came in after were still pretty weak, with the exception of, say, militaries, which obviously grew stronger. They were able to intervene in politics in places like Egypt and Syria. And so the authoritarian systems are outgrowths of these later interventions, and of course the Europeans in between. There's nothing specifically cultural in the Arab world that would lead to the authoritarianism we see in the 50s. What's your sort of impression about that?
Definitely not. No, I fully agree. Any explanation that tries to pin it on culture or on Islam or something like that is just nonsense. I mean, again, one of the things that really struck me when doing the research for this book was how rich, how developed, how sophisticated political life had been in the Arab world in the 1950s. I mean, Syria, to take an example, had a very rich political life. You had parties on all sides of the spectrum, from communists through to Muslim Brotherhood, through Syrian nationalists, obviously the Ba'ath Party, and the old anti-colonial parties of the sort of First World War era, people like the National Party and the People's Party, who I suppose represented a kind of liberal center ground. And they had been all able to sort of coexist. I mean, free parliamentary elections had been held in 1954, when all of these parties gained at least some seats. It was the first communist MP in the Arab world. Khaled Bakdash was elected in those elections. So there had been a very rich and pluralist and diverse and mature political life that had already existed and was capable of flourishing and could have no doubt reformed. And yes, there was corruption and all kinds of, as you say, weaknesses in the structures, but those could have been allowed to develop in healthier and more wholesome ways. Lebanon, of course, another great example. Egypt too. I mean, one of the really foundational moments for me, and I talk about it at some length in the book, is this crisis in March 1954, when the military regime was still quite new, less than 2 years in power. And by this point, they have crushed everyone. They have they banned all parties, legally, constitutionally, absolutely banned. Jailed many of the heads of them, particularly focusing on the Wafd, which was this liberal, sort of centrist, capitalist, I guess, the largest political party in Egypt at the time. with roots going back to the great anti-colonial revolt of 1919. But also, of course, the communists and later the Muslim Brotherhood managed to make enemies, in other words, of the entire spectrum of Egyptian political life and civil society. And that sparked a very wide grassroots uprising against them. In March 1954, street protests with all these powers came together, as well as feminist movements. The famous feminist Doria Shafiq was part of protests, and the left and the right and the center and everyone really in a kind of last-ditch effort to rescue parliamentary democracy in Egypt before it was too late. And regrettably, that failed. And really, you can date the kind of the beginning of Egypt's political wasteland to the failure of that uprising, I think. I mean, from then until really January 2011 was the next really significant mass uprising against the military regime. But I felt it was very important to emphasize that it had happened before. Everyone, when the Arab Spring broke out, everyone said, "Wow, my God, who would have thought protests and democracy in a country like Egypt?" Well, in fact, there's a long history of very similar. I mean, you really cannot shake the feeling when reading about 54 how similar. And again, 1968, another episode, a slightly briefer one that I document in the book. Very much Arab Spring vibes when you read the accounts of often the very same streets and the very same Tahrir Square, history repeating itself kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder if you could expand a little bit further on what the interventions in places like Lebanon, Libya, and Iraq and Syria looked like from Nasser. What was he actually? I mean, you've already talked a little bit about it, but I wonder if you can go a bit further about what he was actually doing in these places.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, I mean, just for those who may not be familiar with the structure of the book, we've talked a lot about Egypt, but it actually does tackle 7 countries: Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, and Libya. And although the focus naturally is in many ways on Egypt more than the others, I did try to give roughly equal attention to all 7. You sort of have to take each country case by case. But overall, the effect is the same. It's to quash democracy, and by force and by other means, but including by violence. So to take Lebanon, for instance, in 1958, there was a great crisis, a domestic crisis in Lebanon, which then got regionalized or internationalized when Nasser began running guns to the opposition in Lebanon, running them through Syria, which by that point had become this merged single state with Egypt, the United Arab Republic. So it was very easy then to use his people in Damascus to just smuggle arms and explosives and money and whatever else was needed across the porous borders between Lebanon and Syria. Also, via the Egyptian embassy in Beirut, there was scandalous scenes of the ambassador personally helping to load machine guns onto the backs of trucks in broad daylight in front of the Egyptian embassy in Beirut in 1958. And that ultimately was successful. Not in the sense that they toppled the regime or anything, but they did ensure that the president at the time, a man called Kamil Shamroun, finished his presidential term that year. And his replacement was a man much more amenable to Abdel Nasser, a guy called Fuad Shihab, the commander of the army, as it happens, not by coincidence, who had been Nasser's preferred candidate to replace the president since before that sort of, they call it the summer of blood. There's a few months of very bloody fighting in Lebanon, kind of presaged as well the civil war that then followed from 1975 to 1990. Many of the same figures and the same divisions, same problems, just erupted to the fore again, although with important differences. A more dramatic case, you might say, is Yemen, where there was a military coup in 1962 undertaken by free officers, so using the same terminology as Egypt's officers, toppled the regime there and sought to set up a kind of Arab nationalist military republic. And very quickly, Nasser supported this and, in fact, sent Egyptian soldiers, initially just as a kind of gesture. But then when it transpired that the old leader, the Imam, was still alive and had fled to a different part of Yemen and was rallying tribal support for his continued rule, a civil war, basically. The stage was set for a civil war. And rather than kind of get out, as you might think, he could have done, he could have said, well, I'm not going to shed Arab blood, I'm just going to pull out at this stage. He decided to do the opposite, poured in tens of thousands of Egyptian troops, an air force, and a full-on invasion of Yemen. And this became then a 5-year-long war, a very bloody one, some 20,000 Yemenis killed, including by illegal chemical weapons, the first instance of chemical warfare by any Arab army in history. So that, I think, I think I say in the book, it was, in humanitarian terms, it was by far the darkest stain on Nasser's legacy. Then to take Libya, another very clear-cut example, where the famous Muammar Gaddafi led a coup in 1969, and Gaddafi is someone who had idolized Nasser since childhood, when he used to memorize his speeches and then re-perform them for friends at school. Again, it was the free officers, or I think they call themselves the free unionist officers. But again, the same terminology. He undertakes a coup in 1969 and immediately gets in contact with Cairo and says, we want to speak to Nasser, we want him to help us. So Nasser sends a delegation, and the Libyans literally tell them, we did this for Nasser, this coup, now it's on you to tell us what to do. And sure enough, Nasser sort of does it from A to Z. He takes them under his wing and shows them precisely how to establish a regime in the image of his own military dictatorship. And he personally sort of mentors Gaddafi, chaperones him around the regional stage. They're always seen together, whether it's praying at Al Azhar Mosque in Cairo or at ceremonies in Libya for the evacuation of foreign military bases there. And Gaddafi for decades thereafter would acknowledge his debt to Nasser, erecting statues to him, naming streets and squares after him. Right up until his death, he continued to see himself as the kind of the rightful heir to Nasser's mantle as the leader hero of the Arabs. As ludicrous as many people might have come to see that by the time of his death, although it was taken a lot more seriously, one should say, in the 1970s, when Gaddafi still had quite a lot of street cred and certainly a lot of money that he was throwing around to militant groups all over the place.
Yes, and you also mentioned in the book that a very important tradition that comes out of Nasserism in case of Lebanon is this Lebanese tradition of killing journalists and intellectuals. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously one of the darker aspects. And I mentioned earlier Gamal Abdel, this journalist who I profiled at some length. He's one of the central characters, really, that I do a sort of deep dive on in the book, and spoke to his sons. His sons have done incredible work, actually. They've spent decades researching their father's assassination, a very in-depth work of investigative journalism that was only published in Arabic. And so I was very pleased to be able to bring some of their findings into English. But yes, Mroué was not the only journalist. There are other stories. One of the really remarkable sources that I lent on for much of the book was this guy Sami Jumar, who was a Syrian military intelligence officer in the Nasserist period, worked very closely with Nasser's people in Damascus, and then much later wrote a memoir just telling stories of all the skullduggery that they had got up to. So there's several stories of, for example, this journalist in Beirut had upset Nasser with his columns, and word had been put out that we should deal with this guy. So their man in Beirut kidnaps him, brings him to Damascus, and the author of this book, Sami Jumar, personally sees the man and ensures that the business is taken care of, and that a bullet is put in his head, and he's talking freely about this kind of stuff. So yeah, that was the reality, and as you say, sadly a tradition that continues to the present day. Lebanon is certainly no stranger to assassinations of public figures, public intellectuals. And I begin the book in the prologue with the story of only a few years ago, man Luqman Salim, who I had known, a Lebanese writer and public intellectual, civil society activist, who was shot in a very similar way to Gamal Abdel, in fact, shot with a silenced pistol at close range. It felt like a very eerie echo. And in fact, his own mother, who's still alive in her 90s now, had immediately drawn the parallel with Gamal Abdel, the man from the 60s, who she had known herself. So there's this kind of serendipitous coincidence that they had all sort of known each other. And,
yeah, it's a really interesting thing to think about all the ways Nasser influences the Arab world today. And so I want to sort of end the last question by asking you about now we've gone past things like the Arab Spring, as you mentioned, when it comes to sort of younger Arabs and them dealing with this history, what does the discourse and debates around Nasserism look like among them?
Yeah, I mean, I happen to think that the standard of debate in Arabic about Nasser is actually quite high. I mean, it's fashionable to bash it and say that it's very poor. But certainly the best sources that I relied on in my book were all Egyptians or other Arabs. There's no question of that. And it has improved since the internet age and now the social media age and the age of the meme. And the Arab Spring, of course, emboldened many people, particularly younger people, to criticize this taboo figure. I mean, Nasser still, of course, has many supporters and fans and admirers. We shouldn't deny that, and it can still be controversial to criticize him. But there is I think the new generation of Arab young intellectuals and novelists and so on are much more willing to do so and have done so to a high degree. There are also scholars, I mean, particularly a man named Professor Sharif Yunus of Helwan University in Egypt, who is probably the world's foremost authority on Nasser and Nasserism. He's written several books on the subject, and I was very honored to be able to speak to him, bounce some questions and ideas off him for my book. So scholarship is progressing, and the general, you open up Arab online websites and newspapers, of course, not so much in the traditional media, but especially in the alternative media spaces that have opened up, again, emboldened by the Arab Spring. There is, I think, a high and always improving standard of debate going on around about Nasser's legacy. Of course, it can always be better. One would always hope to see more. But yeah, I would say I have been impressed, and just would like to emphasize that, yeah, the intellectual shoulders upon which the book stood, if I can butcher Newton's quote in that way, were definitely first and foremost Egyptian and Arab, rather than Westerners. I mean, of course, one can't ignore the Western scholarship. Much of it is very valuable, but the best writing on Nasser has always been and will continue to be, I think, done by Arabs themselves.
Well, it was a great pleasure to read it and review it. I'd like to thank you for coming on MEMO Conversations, Alex Rowell.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next time for another MEMO Conversations. And if you've missed any episodes or would like to watch this one or previous ones, please do go to our website.